Okay, we are recording. So, we will do same thing as we did last week, just so I can find out what one thing you learned that you're really enjoying, or not enjoying. It could be something you learned that you're not enjoying, but hopefully not. And then one thing if you're confused about something, or I liked what you guys did last week and kind of talked about what you were excited to learn next. Does anyone want to start off? Mark?
I never realized what the border box that contained whatever its border and also the content and the padding.
Yep.
Yeah, padding
Yep.
inside all together in one. I never realized that.
Awesome. So the CSS box model, which we'll do a little review of today as well. Awesome.
And looking forward to today's learning about Flexbox.
Cool. Flexbox is awesome. Thanks. Who's up? Alex?
What I learned, you have 4 ways to select an CSS: the inline, ID, class, and the tag.
Awesome. Yeah, lots of different ways. So 4 different ways of selecting for CSS. Cool.
Different specificities.
Awesome. And any confusion or anything excited about learning? Cool. Thanks. Who wants to go next?
Sure. One thing that's quite nice is how much you can style everything. Although that's kind of what's the bit that kind of starts to confuse me. So yesterday, just for fun, I thought I'd have a go at watching a video on doing a drop-down menu.
Okay.
And did a load of it, got I think towards the end, and then it didn't work, and I have no idea why.
Oh no. We can have a look at that later if you want.
Sure.
That's a common frustration with CSS.
Yeah. But like I saved that because I thought I'd screw this all up, so I saved it like having fun, and then it's like how deep you can go into everything. So it can be like you can just put footer, listed, unlisted, listed, A, and then change like something so specific about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's quite interesting.
Very cool.
I'll go next.
Cool. Phil?
One thing I like is just how efficient CSS is, like all the different selectors. You don't have to, you can be lazy, you don't have to like, type in the word blue 50 times, you can just have it apply to one selector.
That's amazing, isn't
yeah,
it?
it's just kind of satisfying. And then something I'm excited about is very specific. I have this list of like 10 things and I want to make it 5 and 5, and I'm really excited to do that.
Oh, you're going to love Flexbox. Awesome. Thanks. Who's up?
Yeah, I really liked just doing all like the style things. Like I was trying to do textures, and that was a lot of fun.
Cool.
Trying to get like textures for the background.
Awesome.
But then I'm also like really excited to start like moving things more than just the orientation of it, like actually moving elements around, and that'll be fun.
Cool. Sounds good.
Well, I guess what I learned was like the priority that CSS reads things in. Like it was a lot of like playing around with that, and yeah, having to learn like what terms switch on. So that was interesting. And then yeah, looking forward to like moving things around, having things beside each other. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
I really like from last class was learning about the box model.
Cool.
And I'm excited to move like these around so it looks more like my wireframe.
Awesome. Thanks.
But I just like this all of CSS in general is really fun to play around with. And I was having a hard time yesterday, I think, with the text decoration or underline.
Okay.
I had it as a footer and it just wouldn't do it, and then I switched it to like a class, and it worked. And then I like looked up online how to like a link that you visited, how to change something like that, and I tried it out. It
Okay.
actually works. So I was like, it works.
Yay!
Excited, yeah.
Those are the best moments
Yeah.
ever.
But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Wicked, cool. CSS is so much fun, and there is so much you can do with it. What else did I want to just run through really quick? Oh, so Mark, you asked a question about reset.
Yes. Is it a thing anymore?
It is. So normalize.css is based on the reset that you're talking about. And basically what it does is set things like your margin padding width back down to like 0 so that your styles are applied the same across all browsers, because some browsers might add like extra padding onto an H1, that kind of thing. So it's like a reset for that. So normalize is probably the standard to use these days.
So the reason why I asked is the only experience I have with CSS and HTML is I build those annoying banner ads.
Ah, okay.
So I'm not allowed to use things like normalize or like because
Right.
it's like extra code that makes them too big and
Gotcha.
they fail, etc., etc. So I have to manually reset everything to 0.
Okay.
So that's my only experience. So I've been kind of out of the loop about how websites get made, and
Sure.
so that was the reason for it. So normalize is actually a best standards or
Kind of, yeah. Like I would
best approach.
I would say it depends on what you're working with. I haven't used normalize for like a sort of standard HTML page. When you get into working with frameworks like Bootstrap, which is like CSS elements created for you, normalize is baked in, so it's already there for you. But you can pretty much get the same effect by setting that yourself and going, margin 0, padding 0. So I don't actually use it. Like professionally, I haven't come across it really. But if you were like, say you were working for a big company that had to be completely browser agnostic and work on like Internet Explorer from years ago, you probably would use that as a standard. But yeah, it's something you can accomplish in your CSS on your own. And I can see that point of not wanting to add more code on top of it, because sometimes there's an argument of you're changing that code to 0, but then you might actually go back and put it the way it was before. So then you're doing it twice. That kind of makes sense. But yeah, and it's not something you need to worry about for the stuff we're doing.
Okay.
But good question. What else? Oh, and also, I think, Ryan, we were talking about lowercase IDs and class names. And I looked that up because I wanted to make sure I was telling you the right information. Hi.
Hello. Is this blockchain UX?
No, I'm not sure where they are.
Yes. Thank you.
Have fun. I mean, we can talk about blockchain, but my knowledge is like that. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so lowercase selectors, class names, and IDs. And I looked into that because, as far as I've been aware, it's just a convention that we follow to have those names lowercase. And I think you might have talked about it on Monday. And it comes from a legacy of XHTML, which was HTML before HTML, where it wouldn't work in the browser if it was uppercase. And now it's just convention and used for readability. Kind of thing. Okay, so now we're getting into Flexbox. Does anyone know what Flexbox stands for? Flexible box. Which we could say, but Flexbox is way more fun to say. Does anyone know what Flexbox is?
It allows you to take care of like moving things around on your page and adapt to like the responsive sizes.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a CSS layout model, and exactly that. It allows you to move things around on your page, and it aids a lot in responsiveness. Okay, so do a quick review of the box model, which we've already talked about a little bit, and then, review, then box model, and then Flexbox. First off, let's have a look at this code. Make it a bit bigger. Okay, what's wrong with this code? Yes. First of all, it's not indented. Now it's indented because I got format unsaved. So good eye for indentation already. What else? What would we do to make this a bit more readable? Right?
Yeah, switch divs for better tags.
Yeah. What would you like to use for the parent one?
Body?
Could you?
No.
I would say probably maybe section. I would imagine this is already in body.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say section, but good instinct because I don't have body there. So, and then I mean these ones could be, I don't know, shout out some names. Article, I like it. Yeah, and these are just images. They're pretty self-explanatory. But what else could we add to them? You are right in name, but there's a particular word for it. And it's alt, yeah. And apparently this is called angry. I don't have that picture. I don't have any of these, I'm sorry. But apparently there's a picture of a beagle floating around somewhere. I won't do it for all of them, but good eye for making our code better. What about, let's talk about the relationship between these elements. So if we're taking this section element, what are its children elements? Brian? Everything, yes, you could kind of call the image, I guess, a grandchild element. But yeah, the articles are like direct children. And then the images are children of the article element. What about the articles if you were like looking at this article compared to this article? What relationship would they have? Sibling, yeah. Awesome. Cool, so that's kind of our review. Now, let's have a look at the box model. Oh, do I have a whiteboard marker? I don't. Okay, bear with me 2 seconds. I'm gonna find a marker. Okay. So if we've got, this is like our div. This is our content, right? What goes? Let me draw this before I get too far. This is our content. Well, it is. I'm really sorry about my writing. What goes outside the content? What's like the next layer from our content box? Padding. And then What's this? Border. And what about here? Margin. Sweet. All right. So if we were going to look at that in terms of HTML, I've just created 2 divs here that are exactly the same. And I've got my CSS box. So right now they don't have margin, border, or padding. So you can see we've got our nice little content boxes. There we go. If I then add margin, let's say pixels. You can see it's moved a little bit further away. You can't see margin. Did everyone read the boring suburban neighborhood guide to the box model? We'll review that in a minute anyway. But it's like the invisible kind of layer around, or in the boring suburban neighborhood, it's like the trees that protect your house from your neighbors. Cool, so then if we add border, and I'm gonna go, this is shorthand for defining a border. Sometimes you can write border like border color, and then you do border weight, but for a nice shorthand you can just define the size and the style as well. You can have like dotted lines, so you can just write it shorthand like that. When we do that, we get a nice border. But you can probably see we've got content is hitting the left side. So we know that it doesn't have padding there, but does anyone know why it's not hitting the top of the box?
Maybe it does have padding.
It does have padding on the top. And this goes back to what we were talking about with reset. It's already got default padding set in. So we could reset that if we wanted to, but why don't we add some padding? And there we go. How's everyone feeling about the box model? Good.
So
yeah.
I just noticed like the boxes got bigger because obviously you added more material around the outside, or sorry, on the inside. So if we use this box model with a border box, would that keep it the same size?
Yes. So inline. What is it? Inline styles. So the default is that it adds the padding and the border to the width of the box. Let me try that. Display. I want to say it's inline. Or inline block. If it shrinks, we know that's the right one. That's not right. Oh, that's not right.
I just distracted you.
You broke the boxes. Bear with me on that because I want to get you the right answer. But you are right in noticing that it expands the box, and the other style is the one that will take into account the padding when it's looking at the total width. So yeah, absolutely.
Is it border box?
Yeah.
Is that
like box sizing, I guess, is the property of border box.
Ooh. See that? And then if I take it off, yes, you're right. Yeah, and Mark, you were right when you said border box the first time. So that border box takes that into account. And it's
The only
nicely
reason I
centered
say
now.
that is because whenever I'm building something for a designer, they'll say, well, the box got bigger. So I have to make the box a specific size.
Well, there you go.
We use one or the other, like, as a default over 2 boxes.
Well, we're going to use Flexbox.
Okay, so like
So.
a third new one, I guess.
I guess you can use either, really.
Okay.
But yeah, but I think Flexbox will solve that.
Okay, cool.
In a different way. Any other questions with the box model? Cool. Let's have a look back at our slides. Yeah, so this is the box model. Did you get the chance to look at the box model in DevTools?
One that looks exactly like the
Yeah. I'll show you just because it's super handy. So when we're looking at this, pull up DevTools. In styles, if you scroll right down to the bottom, I don't have enough CSS, so I can't scroll, but if you scroll right down to the bottom, you'll get your box model. And it's really helpful if you're kind of going, oh, do I add padding or margin or a border here? You can actually, if you select the element, you can hover over and see what each of them are. So you can see this is actually the content box. This is the padding, border, and margin. And that is a really handy tool for when you're kind of going in between the two and trying to, sometimes CSS takes a bit of guesswork, like I'm just going to try to add this on. So that comes in useful. The suburban neighborhood analogy, basically thinking of this being your content, so your height and your width is like your house. The grass around your house is padding, and then your fence is your border, and then trees are the margin. Or you can think of like, I mean, the easiest way for me to think about padding is when you get those big boxes from IKEA with all the little styrofoam bits. That's padding. But you guys seem to have the hang of the box model. So now we'll talk about the display property. Can anyone tell me what we mean by block inline and inline block?
Isn't block, it'll take up the whole section. It'll take up what it needs.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not too sure about that one.
Cool. So exactly that block takes up the whole of the display of that, like horizontally. Inline will only take up the space that it needs to, so that's based on the content. And inline block is a bit of a mix of the two. With inline, you can't set height and width on it, but inline block acts the same way as inline, but you can set height and width on it. And you can set height and width on block as well. And for an example of that, we've got our display property here. Let me just close these. We've got our H1, which is a block level element, our span, which defaults to an inline element, and image. These are all the defaults. Image is a default inline block, and I've added a height on that. But if I take that out, we get massive grumpy cat. So then if I add that back in, be able to see it a little bit better. So we get little grumpy cat. And if I highlight over, you can see block level element, and this is spanning the whole width of the page, whereas inline element only is going to take up what is in that container or element, the content. And then grumpy cat we've told to be 200 pixels, so he's going to be that big. Okay. So now, time to talk about Flexbox. So like we said before, Flexbox is a CSS layout model, stands for Flexible Box Model. And it overrides the default display settings and lets you basically create kind of grid-like layouts with spacing without having to override the display properties of like each individual element. So it's a really good way of being able to align groups of containers in the right way without having to, set a margin and padding on everything in your CSS, because that would take ages. And the reason that Flexbox exists is because that's kind of how we were doing it before it existed. It came out of, and I believe I'm kind of not exactly quoting, but the creator has essentially said that it was created because we were hacking like how to use Flexbox before because it's so much more convenient. It's one of the newer features of CSS. And like I said, it's kind of solving those historical issues that we had with it. Cool. So, the first thing we do with Flexbox is, let's go back. Actually, okay, to have a Flexbox, you have to have a parent element, and that element has to have children elements. And the first thing you do is basically declare that parent element as being Flexbox. So using this example, we've got our article here. So article is our parent element, and we're going to declare that as Flexbox. And then we've got our two child elements here. I'll show you what this looks like before I do that. Maybe that's after, hang on. I lied, I'd already put Flex on it. So I'll show you what it looks like when it's not on. So we've got our elements, kind of how we would expect, like when we're working on our wireframes and we're setting everything out, it follows a relatively straightforward list pattern. But when I add Flex on it, and the way you declare it is by saying display Flex. And there we go. This is a really random story, but this reminds me, every time I add Flexbox onto a property, I think of this. And this is just how I remember, because sometimes, like, if you forget, one of my friends and her husband, when they first started going out, they had like a couple dates and they had that conversation of like, oh, I like you too. And he just looked at her and he was like, you are my girlfriend now. Like, and now they're married. So every time I declare Flexbox, I'm like, you are my Flexbox. So yeah. And that is my random anecdote for today. Okay, so it's Otis. Has everyone met Otis? He's the best dog.
He gets really overwhelmed with a lot of people though. So
Is
you
he?
have to, like, sneak up on him.
Sneak up on the scared dog. I love this place. There's always dogs running around. All right. So now we'll talk about parent properties. So when you're looking at Flexbox, you can have properties that apply to the parent element, and you can have properties that apply to the children element. So we'll look at parent properties first. And the first one we'll talk about is flex direction. So you've got four main ones. You've got row reverse, column, and column reverse. So if I have, let's say this is my flex box, and I've got 4 squares here. Thinking about those 4 things, let's like 1, 2, 3, 4. So row reverse, column reverse. What do you think this is already set as? Row reverse, column, or column reverse? Row, yeah. So row is going to be our default, and that's what flex direction is always set at. If I do this, what's that going to be? Column. And if I do this, 4, 3, 2, 1. What's that?
That's row reverse.
Row reverse. Yep. I want to do column reverse, but same kind of thing. 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'll show you that with actual code. Okay, awesome. So this is what our HTML, you know what, hang on. Looks like to begin with. So what's this outside box? Kind of. I mean, yes, but also no.
Yeah.
This is our parent element. If we look at the code, it is our section with class parent. And then each of these boxes is one of the children. So I'm going to go ahead and this is my CSS, and I've just added, so, so that you can see it, we've got a background color on each of those, and they're set to height and width for the boxes. So that's the styling that's already applied. Does anyone have any questions about any of this code before I go on?
You scroll up just a little.
Yeah.
And because you have the height 200, that's why the black bar or the border goes only as tall as it does.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I've specified the height, so that is following my directions. Right?
So you always want to do it in the division after the parent and before the children. So like if you had a title and you wanted the title to stay in one place, but you wanted to move, let's say, the elements into a row versus a column, you wouldn't call the section that contains the title, you'd only call the section that contains the children.
Great question. And yes, basically. So yeah, if you had a title that you didn't want to be part of that Flexbox, if you wanted it to style like individually, you would style that. You would put that outside of the element that you're applying Flexbox to. Cool. You all good with that so far? All right, let's flex it. So I'm going to apply this to parent class, and this is how we apply to classes in CSS. And I'm going to say display flex. And let's see what we've done. All right, so as you can see, like we discovered over here, the default is going to be flex row. So that's going to pop everything into a nice little row. Space. And then if I wanted to change that, flex direction, let's say column. Column. And you can see before we had these kind of overlapping the box as well, but now with Flexbox it nicely kind of contains them into that container, which is really handy. Check out column reverse, and they flip, and then row reverse, and they go backwards and to the other side. Or I can do row, or I can just take out the flex direction and it'll stay like that. Everyone with me so far? Flex direction. All right. So the next property is justify content. And this is how we align our content on basically on the main axis. And so just like with flex direction, the first thing we'll do is say justify, I can spell justify content. No, come back. Let's go center. Cool. So this is going to be on a vertical axis. So now we've got our content in the center. And this is something that, before I discovered Flexbox, spent so much time trying to center things on pages. So this is super, super handy. Let's see. If I say flex start, where do we think flex start is going to position our boxes? So if this is center, let's have a look. Here. So based on that, where's flex end going to position it?
Lower right.
Top right. But good guess. Yeah. And then space around. So now we've got space around our boxes. And then we can also do space between. And check out, pay attention to what happens here when I change space between. So that's going to take off. Space around is going to make sure it's got an equal amount of space on either side of each element. Space between is going to expand those to hit the ends of the box and make sure there's an equal amount of space in between. And then there is also space infinitely. And that's going to make sure that the space on both sides is the same. These are fun to play around with. There's I've got an exercise to get some more practice with this after the lecture as well. A lot of Flexbox just comes, like, it doesn't kind of come super intuitively until you've played around with a bunch. So the key to this is just practice. Cool, so now we'll look at align items. Align items, so justify content takes care of where the items sit on horizontally. Align items is going to be on, well, basically the cross axis. So if we're using row in our flex direction, align items is going to align them vertically. Alternatively, if we're using column, it's going to align them horizontally. So center. We'll check that out. So now they've popped down to the middle of our page because we're using row. I could flip that and go direction column with an N, and then it sits in the center that way. We've also got, same as before, flex start, which pops it right up here, and then flex end. Where's flex end gonna go? Okay. Yeah. Awesome. And then we've got stretch. And with stretch, basically the elements will stretch to fit the entire width or height, but they're going to follow the default properties that are already set. Ryan, yeah, go ahead.
So suppose if you wanted to separate basically A and B and C and D.
Yeah.
And you wanted them to be like side by side.
Sure.
Instead of like above and below each other. How would you go about doing that?
So I would use justify content. And I would say probably space around. One of the space evenly spaced between. Is that kind of what you mean, or like closer together?
As two groups.
As two groups. Great question. I would put them in two more divs. So I would do div, and I would move these two. So basically, I would like wrap the groups that I want in their own div, and then I would have to do that for here as well. Let's see if that works. We've got a rogue border, but that's kind of the idea. That you would group the ones that you want to be together. Does that make sense? Any other questions? With me? Cool. So we'll pop them back in their row.
So I might be getting ahead of myself.
Go for it.
So let's say those 4 squares were like contents of our website, with like one being the introduction, one being the like the skills, etc. So if you wanted to respond to this and stack on top automatically and go 2 by 2, are we getting to?
We are. Okay. We are getting to that. Some of that comes with the responsiveness, and some of that will naturally come with Flexbox. So actually, let's have a look.
Like I said, if I'm getting us ahead,
No, it's great. like honestly, ask all the questions you want.
Or did you mean like a phone screen versus a laptop?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
like if those 4 boxes, if it was on my phone, would stack up nicely, but on my screen here, they would be like reacting to the wider width, so they would be like that all the way across.
So there are more properties that we have to add on to make it do that. But Flexbox is like the first step in that responsiveness. So you're like right on the thinking of where we're going with it, for sure. Also, I don't know if you've checked this out in DevTools, but this is super handy for, and I'm getting ahead of us now, but because we're going to talk about this when we look at responsive design, but this is really helpful for just seeing how your stuff is going to look on different devices if you wanted to have a look at that. And that's just this little device toolbar down here that toggles that on and off. Cool. And then the last one we've got is with align items is baseline. And I don't think that's going to change much. Yeah, that's not going to change anything for here. But it will align along the baseline. So if there is text like within that, not the A, B, C, and D, but if there's text, it'll align with the bottom of that. Cool, so we've got flex direction, we've got justify content, and we've got align items. Now we've got, and this is probably going to answer some of your question, flex wrap. Got a little ahead of myself with the slides. Flex wraps. And this determines the elements should display on multiple lines. So if we add flex wrap here, there we go. And now it's responsive. Or if I could also make this bounding box smaller. So if I said, where's my box? I'm going to say 75 pixels. Then that's also going to wrap it. Flex wrap, the other options we have are no wrap, although that's the default, so there we have no wrap. We also have wrap reverse. And that's going to basically do the exact same thing. Maybe not. Except it's going to wrap it. Ooh, hang on. Those hyphens. Pesky little hyphens. It's going to wrap it the other way around. Probably for, I mean, I haven't found a use for wrap reverse yet, I'll be honest. Wrap has done the job just fine, but it's good to know. Okay, let's have a look. I've got some more boxes to look at. So again, this is just what it's going to look like to begin with. Lots and lots of boxes. And these are defaulted to these styles here. We've got like class A on a couple of them, class B on a couple of them, and set the width and the backgrounds. They're all different widths. So if I add, they weren't asking us. We're good. Display flex. Cool, no change there. If I say flex wrap, then we get this nicely kind of wrapped. Because before what's happening is it's squishing it, so they're not meeting their like max width, it's just squashing them together. But now they can be the size that we've told them to be. So not only is wrap good for responsiveness, but it's also great for making sure that you're not squishing your elements. Cool. So now we'll talk about align content. And that is basically if the parent has multiple lines of child elements and there's extra space left over, you can use align content to determine what it does with that extra space. So start with center. I took the wrap off. Cool, so without center, it's going to look like that where it's spaced out. But if I want it to center, then I can pop that property on. If this box didn't have the height specified on it, so if I took that out, we wouldn't have the option to use align content because it's basically taking up as much of the box as it is. It's only if this box is actually bigger and you've got that leftover space that align content comes into play. Got a rogue semicolon there. So, got flex start. Where do we think flex end is going to pop the boxes? Yep, bottom. I've also got, and this is similar to align items, I've got space around. Space around. Space between. And we've got stretch as well, which will basically kind of stretches that it takes up the extra space if there is space. Cool, so we talked about align content. So those are the parent properties. We've got flex direction, align items, justify content, align content, and flex wrap. Is everyone with me so far on those? Makes sense? Cool, so now there are properties that you can apply to the child elements to basically like control what they do in a bit more detail. So one of them is order. And so they're going to default to whatever order they're in the HTML. So we've got A, B, C, D, E, and F. If we did like row reverse, they would go in the opposite order. But if we wanted to specify and tell something to go first, we could use the order element. So let's say I'm actually going to create a new one and put it in the middle. Someone give me a noun.
Dog.
Dog. Excellent. Okay, so we've got a dog class, and I'm going to use the B class, but for dog. Cool, so we've got our dog box. And if I want that to go first, all I have to do is say order. And basically, they're all defaulted to 1. So if you say -1, that's going to go first. If you say anything +1, that's going to go last until you order. You can set it that way by saying, let's say -1, and that's going to go first. And then I don't have to do anything else. I know that that's always going to be first. If I wanted to order them all, I could do that, and I could add order onto each one. But this is a nice, quick way of popping that right at the beginning. So it goes in order of smallest number to least number. I could start at 99 if I wanted, but then I would have to number them all like 100, 101. So I could also say, let's put all the child B's at order 3, and then that's going to put all of these ones at the end because they're of that class. I could, again, like I said, I could do 99. And they're still going to stay there. If I put a order on class C of order 98, then that's going to group these ones second to last because it's the second biggest number. That makes sense? Cool, so that's order. And then we've got align self. And this is basically the same idea as the align that we already have, or the align content, but you can apply that to a specific child. So if you wanted like one of those elements to be in a different position, that's where you could use align self. You could actually, if you wanted to use that for like your title, like Ryan and I were talking about positioning the title, if you wanted to have them all in a Flexbox, that's where align self would come in handy. But let's say dog. Align self. Flex start. And then we'll compare it to center. Can you do it? Yeah, so that's going to align that one specifically. If I get rid of the wrap, that's going to look a little bit clearer. So now it's aligning it right in the center of the page. If I said flex end, where's that going to go? Bottom. Out. Cool, so that's align self. So you can control the child elements within your Flexbox. Okay, and now this is the last one we've got, actually. Oh no, we've got 2 more. Flex grow. So sometimes, and you'll probably find this useful when you're working on your pages today. In fact, I think it's in Compass. I know it's in Compass. Is flex grow, and that is basically letting an element grow if it needs to. And so the value that you give it, and you represent it with flex grow with a number. So let's say, actually, let me get rid of these ones for now. Two. And if you put flex grow on 1, should really put them on the other ones as well. Okay, so we've got A, B, C, and D. Gotta save my HTML. Cool. So now they're laid out like this. If I change 3 to 1, that's gonna shrink. If I change this to 5, then it's going to get bigger. This basically determines how much space it takes up in that line. If you set it to 1, if you set all of them to 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and 1 is the default, really, then they're all going to take up as much space as they would normally. And the reason they're different sizes is because we've set them at different sizes. But if this might be a little clearer. Now their default, if I set 4, then it'll grow. Makes sense? And then the last thing we have is flex shrink. And that is like the opposite of flex grow, and that lets them shrink if they need to. So if we said...
So even though we've typed in width 50 pixels, it grew, or...
Yes, and I'm gonna say that's because... So that is 50 pixels, but it's shrinking the other ones. And it's shrinking them because we've told it we've said that this box is allowed to get bigger. And that box wants to be 50 pixels. So by saying that, we're kind of saying, it's like we're giving it priority over the other widths.
This is the hero one and the other one's fault.
Exactly, yeah. I know, it's terrible. But yeah, so you're letting it kind of override the other widths on that to be 50 pixels. So then we'll check out flex shrink. I'm just gonna shrink. Hang on, those are 50 pixels. What I just told you might have been a lie.
Yeah, that's why I was a little confused.
No, you're right. 50 pixels. So it's the other way around then. It expands that one as opposed to shrinking the others. Yeah, ignore what I just said. Now they're 50 pixels. But if I made them smaller, then they would shrink because this is now allowing them to shrink. That's not quite doing it. Right, okay. So now it's allowing them to shrink, which is taking their width and getting smaller. Flex grow is going to come in handy a lot more than flex shrink because that's going to control like how you kind of position something to be smaller or larger. But that pretty much covers the properties of Flexbox. So we've got our parent properties, which are probably the majority of what you're going to be working with. And then you've got child properties for kind of special cases. Any questions?
Just with the flex grow thing,
Mm.
is the number that you type in like a multiple of the pixels? Like if it's a 2, does it do like 2 times 50 pixels, or is it related?
That's a great question. Let me look into that, and I will find out. Because I think it is only like an assignment number of it's going to take like the max width of that container, and if you say, actually, yeah. So if you said 1,
Yeah.
let's say you've got 2 boxes, you said 1, and you said 2, then the 2 is going to take up twice as much space as 1.
Okay.
That
Yeah.
makes sense.
So it's relative to the other boxes, basically.
Relative to the parent
Not the
container.
pixels you said. Okay.
Yeah.
Relative to, okay.
Yeah, I don't think. I'll check that out because I'm really curious now. I don't think it has anything to do specifically with the pixels
Okay.
themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's like a ratio. If you have this much space, how are you
Exactly.
gonna break it down
Yeah.
for each box. And this one gets 2 times, this one gets 1,
Yes.
this one gets 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the other thing is you might not always be using pixels.
Okay.
There are other kind of measurements of width and height. So, yeah.
Thanks.
No worries. How's everyone doing? Good. Good. Okay. So that's Flexbox in a nutshell. I've got this is optional. You can get right into the compass work if you want to, but Flexbox Froggy is like the best thing ever. And this really, when I was learning Flexbox, this is what made it click for me. It's really it's fairly sort of quick to run through. You can do as much as you want, but I really recommend finding at some point in time to check it out and do a couple of them, because it's a really good visual of how Flexbox works, and it may make things easier down the line. So I'll send that out in Slack. But yeah, you are free to work on your compass work, and give me a shout whenever you have any questions. If you get stuck, if you want to chat something through or want a code review, I am here for the next 2 hours. And you are paying me to be here, so ask lots of questions. Sorry, say that again? Basically around, so you can go either way. But it's the other side of that wall.